If you ask people to choose a miracle, then I suspect one of the first ones that would come up was the feeding of the 5,000, and that's the miracle that we're going to look at today. I'm going to read about it from Matthew's Gospel, although it's actually found in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, with some subtle differences between them all. But this is from Matthew chapter 14, and I'm going to read from verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns, and when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said, and he directed the people to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, beside the women and the children. There are 2 stories like this in the Bible. This is the one. The other is the feeding of the 4,000 men, and you find that in a couple of chapters on in Matthew 15. But we're going to look at the feeding of the 5,000 in here. Now, this miracle takes place, if you remember the start of it, she said, when Jesus heard what had happened. What had happened was that John the Baptist had been beheaded. That must have been very upsetting for Jesus. He was a friend, a relative, a colleague, and someone who Jesus had had quite a bit of contact with. So I'm sure that was upsetting. So it's reasonable Jesus withdrew to a solitary place. He wanted a little bit of peace and quiet, just to be with God and with his disciples, away from these huge crowds that were following him wherever he went. So he went to a place. Different Gospels talk differently about this place. Best definition of it is as a place of solitude. We hear that there was green grass there, so it couldn't have been very desert-like. So it was perhaps up a mountain somewhere, not far from the Sea of Galilee. This miracle happens in a place where lots of Jesus's miracles happened, and yet it was a place where there was very little spiritual growth. And just in Matthew 11, a few chapters before, Jesus just delivered a stinging condemnation on this area, because despite all the great works that have been done in this area, people have still not repented and not changed how they see Jesus. But if you're Jesus, it's very hard to find any peace and quiet anywhere, because despite Jesus' desire to get away from the people and away from the crowd follow him, and they all come running after them up this mountain. And there's a great phrase here, I think, in the Bible, where it talks about the fact that Jesus had compassion on the multitude. I don't know about you, compassion is not always easy to have when you're tired and harassed or upset and somebody wants something. Compassion is quite difficult, but Jesus had compassion on the crowd, and it said he healed the sick that were among them. You see, this passage is full of miracles, because the whole business of healing the sick doesn't even get a mention by many people, because that miracle gets lost in the story of the feeding. But Jesus, wherever he goes, is a worker of miracles. So they have this huge crowd 5,000 men, plus the women and the children. The disciples say to him, send them away so they can get something to eat. And Jesus says, well, you give them something to eat. I'm glad Jesus didn't say that to me, because I would have thought, well, how am I supposed to do that? But there was a boy in the crowd who had these 5 barley loaves. Barley loaves was the bread of the poor, and 2 fish, and he offered those to share, and out of that happened this marvelous miracle. So the food was a problem because they had nothing to eat, and they were in the middle of nowhere. It was getting late in the day, so opportunity to buy it, and they were in a pretty much of an isolated location, and all they had were these 5 small loaves and 2 fish. The disciples, of course, thought they would solve the problem by sending the people away, but Jesus intends to solve the problem by a completely different way. And one of the things that often happens in these stories, we see people having their own ideas as to what Jesus would do, and actually Jesus often does something very different to what we should do. So the disciples bring the bread and the fish to Jesus, and he blesses it and breaks it. He gives it to the disciples, and the disciples give it to the people. This miracle is in this series we're looking at, in how Jesus has a command over nature. And this miracle is really a creating miracle, because what Jesus is doing, he is creating bread and fish, enough to feed 5,000 people. And that really is quite amazing. The boy, well, how generous he was to give all the bread and all the fish that he had. I would have kept a little bit for myself before I gave the rest to Jesus, but he handed it all over. It's a real picture of the generosity of spirit that is required if we're going to work with Jesus and see things happen in our lives and in the world. And the boy was ready to serve, wasn't he? He was along the slightly different, but he was along the lines of, here am I, send me, from Isaiah. He says, here, this is what I have, take this and use it. And it's a very big step of commitment. God is more interested in quality than quantity. So this boy gives all that he has. Okay. So Jesus shares out the bread, he shares out the fish, the 5,000 men and all the women and the children eat their fill, and then they get to clearing up afterwards. I think this is a very interesting story for our time, because I tell you, if we go for a picnic, we might pick up the litter that we've left, but we're not very good at picking up the crumbs that have fallen on the floor. We think, well, we'll leave them to the birds or something. But this bit of cleanup was about more than that. So the one of the John's Gospel uses the word fragments, or some translations use broken pieces. So this was not crumbs, it was actual pieces that were left over. When Jesus blesses us, when he meets our need, he more than meets it. And so there are these 12 baskets left over, a great amount of food. I wonder what happened to it. I'm sure that it went to someone that could need it, because actually it's a bit of a where we ought to be to do it today, about the waste in our society. And there's too much of it. But with Jesus, there is no waste. The supply is more than enough to meet the people's needs, and the leftovers are taken so they can be used elsewhere. John's Gospel reports the reaction to this miracle by those who were fed. The reaction is seen in some of the comments made by the people. So they say that some of them want to say, well, Jesus is obviously the Messiah. Jesus thought they might come and make him king in John's Gospel, and Jesus didn't want that. He didn't want to be a secular king. He wanted to be a spiritual king. And but later on, not much later on, when Jesus pressed the spiritual aspect of his ministry, many of these people left him. So despite seeing the miracles of healing, despite being fed in this amazing way, and despite being so convinced about who Jesus is, only a few short time later, they are deserting him and giving up on him. So parable, or the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, remains one of my favourites, and I hope it's one of yours too.